Governance, which was related to the previous point, affects disaster response and risk reduction outcomes. A poorly governed country or a country with governance problems is going to have a hard time achieving the same thing that another country with the same level of income, the same natural hazards, et cetera, same types of climate change will be able to achieve. And part of this has to do with the long-term nature of climate adaptation, but also that disaster risk reduction requires trade-offs. And you can't do those, you can do those trade-offs in a dictatorship pretty easily, but most people won't support them, and so you'll find everybody doing things as opposed to following the regulations. So governance is really key on this process. Climate change funds can, this originally said will, but I tempered it this morning. Climate change funds can contribute to conflict. A very important point, and this was brought up by Cynthia, that you have to be very careful about how you're using the funds, because you can create anticipated income, anticipated assets, things like that, and create a conflict situation. The fault lines are there. You don't necessarily know about it. We talked a lot about Madagascar, which the conflict wasn't caused in Madagascar by climate change funds, but there were a lot of fault lines there that people didn't recognize because there wasn't a conflict vulnerability assessment done. And so the tools to do that, and it's very important to do that before you start giving out money or creating the expectation that people are going to get money, as we had heard from a case in Ecuador. Do no harm. Okay, sounds good. It's even, people debate whether it's actually an appropriate terminology even. But the most important point is, don't presume that good intentions lead to good outcomes. That's a quote, okay? Not from me, but from somebody else. And that's really important. We've learned this in disaster response. Just because we think we're going to do a good job, we're helping people, does not mean that we're going to have a good outcome. Assessing impacts, we talked a little about it. So assessing impacts is key. You have to do it. But are we assessing the impact of us on the climate or the climate on us? Okay, it depends. What type of assessment you're doing, how you're doing it, et cetera, et cetera. Now I want to highlight that a lot of tools already exist for these things. But you can't go in and do, assess the carbon impacts after a disaster. It's really not going to be appropriate. You may want to assess changing weather patterns after a disaster. Nobody's from TSA in the room. I travel a lot, so I'm very nervous about putting this up. Something referred to as the TSA effect or the TSA response. Every time something happens, something else is added in. Okay, so now there's the printer cartridges, and next week it'll be, previously it was your underwear, now it's printer cartridges, et cetera, et cetera. All valid things, but what we do is we keep adding more into the assessment process and more into the response process, which inhibits our ability to get stuff done and increases the likelihood that most of that new stuff will just not get done, okay? And Scott and I have been dealing with a situation recently where we see that happening, okay? There's more requirements, but less and less tendency to do them. We need, for contextual analysis, we need to look at vulnerability, but also vulnerable people. It's the people that are the bottom line here, not the climate, not the vulnerability. But we also need to look at who and how we do this. There are a lot of vulnerability assessment tools. There's PRAs. There are all sorts of other kinds of things. But they tend to produce reports. I think somebody mentioned that this morning, a lot more reports. We need to think about who and how we're going to have an impact. And are you going to speak a little bit more about that?
About the impact assessment?
Yeah.
In a certain context.
Okay, if not, we'll bring it up later. Okay. We want to look at conflict vulnerability assessment for the reasons I noted previously, but also we already in disaster management, disaster response, try to look at conflict, and in certain cases we'll actually deny or reduce assistance to areas where the assistance might create the potential for conflict. So that's already starting to happen. It's a very difficult process to do. If we come back to climate change funding and other opportunities, and having to start make those decisions is quite difficult. So that's something that needs to be considered well. How much can be crammed into a post-disaster impact assessment? Not much. I've been trying to do it for 20 years. And we keep coming up with more stuff, more checklists, more this, more that, and they go out and do the same thing. Fly around in a helicopter and say, it looks flooded, or it doesn't look flooded. Okay, that's it. So take videotapes now, that's the big thing. So we have to be careful about or realistic about the implications of trying to get more out of the same people doing more work with fewer resources. One thing that came up, and this is a term that I like, but I think captured a lot, we need to be starting to look at optimal ignorance as a modality. Rather than going out and use what's called the garbage can approach, where we collect all the information possible, we need to say these are the key things that we need to know. They give us a 90% confidence rate or an 80% confidence rate, and use them. Now, USAID particularly and the humanitarian community in general has an advantage because we've been looking at food security issues for 25, almost 30 years now, and we've had to start doing these kinds of things in a very practical sense. So food security, we talk about vulnerability, we talk about hazards, we talk about risk reduction, all these other kinds of things. And so there may be good lessons from that process that can be applied to looking at climate change. Approaches, quickly. Climate change is made up of hazards and vulnerability, rainfall and people, and we need to balance them. We need to focus on both. There's a lot of assessment about changes in rainfall and temperature, et cetera, but there's not really a lot of assessment about the real impact on people. There's projections, there'll be more disasters, but that doesn't tell us anything. Of course there'll be more disasters, there are more people. It's logical. So we need to have those links made clearer. Lives, livelihoods, and local capacities. We need to realize that people on the ground themselves respond to all the disasters that occur, and they're going to be responding to climate change issues. We can't ignore them. We have to look at how they live and how they deal with these events. Multiple adaptations are needed, but we also find siloed projects. I'm not sure that's an English word. A lot of projects are, we're going to do microcredit, okay, but it's not taking into account that the people who get the credit are using 12 or 10 or 25 different ways to adapt to a variable climate, to lack of rainfall. So the way that we do development is not very much, in many cases, like people adapt to the risks and hazards that they face, okay? So how do you do integrated development? This is a buzz term of a couple of years ago, or decades, centuries ago, last century. How do you do integrated development? So if you're going to talk about multiple adaptations on the part of the population affected by climate change and disasters in general, how do you do that? How do you have a project that addresses 6 different things at the same time and balances and changes that package to respond to the different conditions? One year it rains too much, one year it doesn't rain. How do you have a project that deals with those kinds of things? We need to go beyond regulations and to use a term that Eric likes, positive deviance, which means?
It's based in health kind of outcomes. It's positive deviation, not deviance, but
Sorry.
just kind of like a positive deviation idea. There's a program called PDHARP, Positive Deviations HARP. It's basically terminal alcohol programs. The idea being that there are certain mothers out there in the same kind of socioeconomic status as other mothers, but for some reason they're able to be more successful, have more successful health outcomes, etc. And so it looks, as opposed to looking at it from a what's wrong perspective, it's what's successful perspective. And then further, as a training methodology, the mothers actually become the ones who do the training. So the idea being that it's more effective to learn from another mother than it is to learn from Kelly to tell you how to do breastfeeding.
I deny it.
Apparently he didn't like that joke.
Okay, let's get to more mundane things.
What is DR and DRR? Sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, I actually put that up there so somebody would ask that question. CC, we love these. I put this up because yesterday we kept coming up with more. Climate change, impact assessment, disaster response, and disaster risk reduction. Okay.